What is going on, everybody? It is Kevoy. It is Master Signified Bodies, the Big Sig over here with Nick, freaking Ghostface. Over here, we're about to finish off with another banger. We're now headed into Beyond Psychology, concluding with the optical schema and the topics of the imaginary. Beyond psychology, now we're about to go into the meta-analysis of desire. And so I have my colleague Nick with me. We're getting into the seesaw of desire. What is up with desire? What is up with desire, Nick?
What is up with desire? What's up with seesaws? I haven't been on one for a while. I don't know if this is someone who speaks French maybe can clarify this. There is a discussion of seeing in here. This is one of the thematics at play. So I'm also wondering if seeing, I saw something, if that might have something to do with the pun here, but that might not work in French. But look, if this is just a fortuitous discovery,
it's like almost like,
then
you know, the way the
let's go with
seesaw
it.
is, it's like a back and forth between like the subject and the object, or the what we were talking about before, the two narcissisms, the primary and the secondary, ego, ideal ego. And you know, it's kind of funny how like this chapter is called Seesaw of Desire, and then the next one is called Fluctuation of Libido. A fluctuation of like a back and forth.
Not purely coincidental.
Yeah, definitely not.
Imagine. But you see something, and once it's seen, I saw it. That which I saw becomes an object for me. So there's a back and forth, a lot going on with the seesaw. Very fun playground apparatus.
Structural playground for desire.
Shall we dive right in?
Let's do this.
All right.
We're already like talking about like a foreshadow of Schreber, which I think is pretty interesting.
Whenever we start a chapter with Schreber, you know it's going to be good.
Oh yeah.
Schreber, what I'm learning from reading Anti-Oedipus is Schreber's actually the one who figured it all out. He's superior to both Lacan and Freud in a certain sense. Just his performance of schizophrenia maybe contains more to be chewed over and digested than you could even find in any of Freud or Lacan's works.
And it's also funny how like his memoir, he's like, after writing this memoir, he's like, I hope that this will go into the hands of like theology. Like he wanted his memoirs and experiences of like God and having to become woman to give birth to humanity again, like to be like a treatise on mysticism and theology. But it's like, no, he his book came into the hands of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. But if we're D&G about it, they'd be like, well, they're both priests at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, one is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the other one is, you know, the Oedipal complex of mommy, daddy, me.
Yeah, for them, Schreber is almost an idol because Schreber is the one who, in a sense, like plasmically evades and transcends the Oedipal triangle that very cookie cutter like is tempted to be placed on him. So shout out to Schreber. And I like Lacan here is kind of flexing because he's like, well, there are only 2 copies in Europe of Schreber's memoirs, but I managed to find one, or 2 copies that are translated into French, right?
Yeah.
I managed to find one. No big deal.
No big deal.
That's the first of Lacan's flexes. He starts this chapter with that flex, and then he ends it with another flex, which we'll cover later.
The flexecutioner over here.
Flexecutioner, the original. He had no qualms about flexing. Yeah. One thing about Lacan.
That's what happens when you think with your feet.
There you go. The little trickster. Nothing of particular importance, I would say, in this introduction, other than we're going back to Freud, always back to Freud.
Yeah, and I think like right here, like what we get into in the second page on like 164 is like really like what's interesting is his critique of, in a sense, American psychoanalysts and different theorists that want to desexualize libido, and or what he says is the point of almost delibidinalize de-aggressivated aggression, which is like very much in that sense we stray from the path of what psychoanalysis is supposed to be about, and with the Freudian experience that there is libido and it is sexual. We're beating it like a dead horse with the whole thing about the lure. This is why he's also comparing the lure and saying that there are a bunch of captations, or these lures that animals go through. So they're never in this potential of becoming, I guess, thrown into the symbolic order or developing something other than just this mere captivation for sexual reproduction, survival, or whatever. But yet it's still libido. But for us, it's like almost this libido becomes entranced upon this image and wants to invest in that. And this is something that these American analysts or just overall psychologists seem to avoid, because maybe they're so harped upon like, oh, why does it have to be sexualized? I think there's something other than sexuality to this. You know.
Almost that kind of Puritanism late
It's
in
yeah,
their
Puritanism.
reaction.
Yeah.
Or almost something similar to, I don't know, Impossible Meat. You want the meat without the
Killing the
slaughter.
cow. Yeah.
Same thing with the libido here. You want the libido without the sex. Sorry to break it to you, but it is sex. Chris is also, that name is a callback to our patient who likes brains, likes to eat brains.
Oh yeah.
Chris was the one who Lacan was giving shit to for kind of patting himself on the back for this triumph of interpretation, which only led his patient to further exteriorize
Yeah.
his
Yeah, I
symptom
forgot
and
about that,
stuff.
dude.
All right. Anything else to say about this short introduction?
um,
He's gonna focus on the ego and the id in this
yeah.
chapter. Have you read that, or
I haven't read The Ego and the Id, but that is, if I'm not mistaken, Freud's introductory to the superego. But I think like what is important about message, like referencing this, is the fact that we need to stay on this notion of narcissism and what it entails and how it functions, especially if it is these unconscious impulses, this libido. How does it relate to the ego? Because like I think it's also interesting too, since we are readers of Freud through the spectacles of Lacan, you don't get this in popular readings of Freud, especially like in your psychology 101 or like your psychology class in high school. It's like you have these fixed categories of the mind, id, ego, and then superego, and the ego like mediates between. It's like, no, that's not really how it works. Like actually the ego is invested by this id, the libido. There is in a sense a kind of distinction, but it's still an investment by libido. And the superego is like a manifestation of the ego's introduction into the symbolic, into something where speech takes place.
what's interesting about that is you just reminded me of what I was listening to earlier. Our good friend of the show, Brian Becker, in his discussion of Heidegger, draws this distinction between, I guess, existential and categorical types of
Yeah.
philosophy. And there is this attempt in academia to, well, almost try to ignore Freud altogether to the extent that it's possible. But when we do talk about Freud, in the academic context, he is distilled, or let's say ossified, into a set of categories. And it seems almost like at this point, I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that Lacan is introducing a kind of phenomenology into Freud, or to animate Freud with some phenomenology, to bring certain of these categories to their dialectical limits and show how they're interrelated and how to get them moving in a sense.
I think that's a good point with the phenomenological aspect. And not only in the case of the intersubjective relationship, which this imaginary relationship, which even most analysts would even agree upon, about like this lived experience of dealing with the patient. But then it's like there's a limit to that because we're always stuck in this imaginary. And this is also a good thing you mentioned about phenomenology, since it's always about like embodied experience or lived experience. It starts from the reference of mainly not only interpretation of the image at hand, but it's a gestalt. This is like purely in the imaginary realm. It doesn't transcend or even take into account the symbolic, which plays into part. Thus, we end up in a sense, especially if we're talking about psychoanalysis, the analyst and the analysand, this constant struggle of mastery or anticipation of the image of the lore. Thus, we have what he said, aggressivity, and aggressivity can also lead to aggression in some cases, but mostly aggressivity is something of what I think he says it in Function and Field, of an existential thing, which one loses control over the mastery of themselves, thus of their entire being. So it's like this constant need to retaliate, the master-slave dialectic, if you want to say so. But again, it's something that doesn't get taken into account with these other types of like two-body psychology simps, and people just stuck into like the imaginary realm.
And we are, well, we're not just approaching, we've crossed the threshold into the symbolic now. What he does here that's interesting is present us with a simplification of the optical schema. And my interpretation of this was, well, one, I don't think he wants us to abandon the optical schema just yet. It's kind of the backbone of the entire seminar up until this point, at least. So he wants us to keep it in view. But I think this might also represent a progression or another step, not in the dynamic, but at least in terms of the representation of the optical schema, something that can be used in a different way.
Yeah, he's definitely not letting go of the optical schema. It'll come up again in seminar 8, and then definitely 11. You'll see it again. So
what I mean, though, is that just to clarify, it's like he used it to help us metaphorize a certain dynamic by which the subject emerges as an ego and as like an interplay of images. But here, I think he takes it kind of a step forward, because representation is always important.
Yeah.
For Lacan. And now I feel like we almost have the optical schema seen more from the point of view of the symbolic, because as I understood it, sort of here, because he calls this the real image formed thanks to the concave mirror and the virtual image, and the I is removed and the virtual subject here is removed. And I think that here the I, which is the subject, and the real image are collapsed into one, as are the virtual image and the virtual subject. Does that make any sense to you, or do you see
I
it
was actually, yeah, you said it a lot more simply than I did. It's like you should take these. It's almost like a mathematical formula where certain symbols are taken as given. Like you should know this, that this a priori means this, that, and third. Like, and it's kind of cool because it's like these little schematics that he's doing, and then simplifies it. It's definitely not just a simple image of just like O and virtual O in the plane mirror. It's like you should already know by definition what this implies based upon your knowledge of the optical schema. We're just going to make things easier in a sense with my schema, but except it's still complicated in the fact that there's a dynamic going from a different orientation. And yeah, I think it is tying in from the reference of the symbolic order or signification.
right? Because O, and he says why O and O. I don't know that he explicitly relates the O to the word object, but that's what it is, right, Andrew?
I don't. I would say yeah. It's definitely the object, but again, we're never talking about like an actual object, like the object that I'm holding, like this laptop. It's always like representation, especially in object relations. They're never talking about actual objects.
Right, but
Actual objects are literally there to piggyback the representation, the fetishism, and the fantasy.
right. So, but it's not purely at random that he
Yeah,
uses
I,
the
I
letter
think
O, right?
no, I think there is a purpose to it.
And I would, this isn't gospel, but I would speculate that maybe we even have a kind of prefiguration of object A here, maybe.
I think as so far as we talk about like if there's a real object, yes, and or the real image, as he'll say, that could be the dosting or the object A, the agalma.
But essentially, the entire human condition is contained.
Yeah, and it is like through this condition, it's like this with the lack comes, or through desire comes this not only virtual image but a maybe I'm using retroactivity of reflecting back and thinking that there is this real image out there, this real thing out there, my real self out there that I can achieve, my real desire. But it's always only recognized through the other, it seems like. This other's not necessarily like another person, but just like the other of the symbolic order. And
Which might also be what the O stands for,
yeah,
not
the virtual
French,
O.
but for us, we could take it as maybe
Yeah. I
other.
mean, because it seems like this virtual O, right? Because what is the girl saying? Like, oh, you mustn't think my whole life will be unfold into O, and in virtual O, poor little thing, your life will unfold into O and in O. The same as for everybody else. Like this virtual O is pretty much the image that one sees himself going to be one day. Like if you are going into like I don't know, like college, and then you major in like biology, but then you want to go into medicine. It's like I imagine myself one day becoming a doctor, and that's like the virtual image.
And this is the future anterior to which he referred in the previous chapter, the will have been.
Yes, the will have been.
The will have been, temporally speaking, I would say, corresponds to the form of our desire. The past in the future, which is strangely enough the only way we can sort of conceive of the present is from that perspective. what will have been. And it also, to me, kind of evokes the shapes passing each other in a vacuum, and the one shape being experienced as its trace before the actual shape
Yeah.
is apprehended. There's a similar evocation there, at least for me. What's interesting to me also is that there's an emphasis here on the ideal
Mhm.
the ideal I, and he talks about the, or we could say ideal ego, more than I expected before I read this, because I think in many discussions of the difference between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, um, a lot of theorists tend to jump to the ego ideal as the more compelling concept. But here, Lacan always wants to relate it back to the ideal I
Yeah.
as being of central importance.
Yeah. And it seems like because this ideal I has some type of like phantasmatic quality to it. So it's like maybe it's not even the fact that the ego ideal is virtual and the fact that we could, in a sense, materially strive towards something similar to the ego ideal, but it's only in the sense that it'll bring us towards the ideal ego because that's what matters most, the state of wholeness and pleasure and satisfaction, the state of completion.
And this is where we get, I think, what he's going to say a little bit later on, the cross pollination between virtual and real objects, imaginary objects and real, well, not imaginary objects and real objects, but virtual and real,
Yeah.
in that when we hear real in this context, I think we should always think of the ideal ego,
Mm-hmm.
and then what's virtual, or maybe even symbolic rather than imaginary, which I've misspoke before, has to do with the ego ideal.
Well, so yeah, there is a relationship towards like at least like a parallel relation towards the symbolic, the superego and the ego ideal, but there's definitely some imaginary situations in there in the sense that you're mirroring. Like, let's say you like encounter like, or let's just keep it simple in your analysis, right? The the analysan will kind of, in a sense, find some ego ideal in the analyst in the transference in insofar as there is the imaginary relationship towards it, um keeping the person in the little well, maybe going a little ahead, but as the little other, the immediate intersubjective relationship, they could fantasize and really kind of feel envious towards this analyst and saying like, oh, they have it all, I wish I could be in their position, they seem happy, they seem like content, and here I am, you know I'm a mess, I don't know what I want, and I feel like I'm in my dog days, like I'm over here on the couch, I don't feel whole and complete, and yet they have this, I should be in this position.
It's interesting you say that, because if I'm not misremembering, I think Lacan recommends to the analyst to actually, though, ultimately occupy the place of the ideal ego, in the sense that you're right, because the ego ideal is always the portal to the ideal ego. And it's like once you get beyond that symbolic transference that you seem to be talking about there, it's like then you get to the heart of the matter, which is the, well, we can't separate the two necessarily. They're sort of braided together.
Yeah.
But what are the specific primordial libidinal investments that the place of the analyst embodies and essentializes, maybe even beyond that.
Well, in a sense, during the transference, the projection of the unconscious content comes about. Something not just in the imaginary where there is this ego to ego relationship, but in the act of speech, signifiers come through, especially if you're associating, you start to realize certain aspects of your desire or how you find meaning in certain enjoyments that, especially if you're neurotic, the more you associate, the more you realize, oh shit, like yada yada yada, like, oh, like I finally realized like why I do this. But what the analyst is there to do is to kind of guide the treatment. So they are in a sense, I wouldn't say in a sense they're embodying like this ego ideal, but rather the ego ideal seems to be seen by the analyzan. But at the same time, if there is this instance that what you said, Lacan was saying that the analyst should
We'll
kind
get
of
to
take the
that in a
stance
little bit.
yeah, if they
He's
get in the stance of
right.
that,
Yeah.
the other, what was it, you said they get in the stance of the ideal ego, it makes sense because they're getting towards the primal trauma.
Right. Not to occupy the place of the ego ideal, but that's what's projected or superimposed onto them, possibly by the analyzan.
Yeah,
Exactly what you're talking about in the transference. They must be so happy, like they have this
yeah.
robust career. They're
I
probably
got here
very
before my
self-involved.
analyst, and I saw out the window that they were driving like a Ferrari or something like that. Or it's a nice car, like they have it all.
Imagine psychoanalysis, the things that the study of it can procure for you.
Yeah, I mean it's true though. Like those little things, like in the everyday experience, because at the end of the day, it is an everyday experience, but it's just like situated in the office. But those little things that change the resistances or the transference is like, oh, oh wait, they just drive a regular like beat up little Honda Civic. Like they're not really all that. Like it just depends on like the type of like person, especially if they're neurotic. They're always nitpicking, judging people based upon like what they wear, how they walk, how they talk, how they said hi, how are you. It's like, oh, this reminds me of like so and so, and oh, somebody in my family member, somebody in my family who used to say this hi in the same exact manner, and I just can't really stand them. They're good for nothing. So maybe they're like, just these weird associations.
Yeah,
So
there's I think it's like the first scene in the entire series, or not. Yeah. It's the opening scene of The Sopranos where he's like staring at this painting outside of the analyst's office, Melfi, and
yeah,
he hasn't met her yet, but he's like infuriated by this painting that's just an innocuous image of like a farmhouse or something. And he says to her, like, that painting is like specifically designed to, I forget exactly what he says, but basically elicit a response from the patient. And throughout the whole series, he has this kind of attitude of like, you can't get one over on me.
yeah,
Think you can, but you can't, and I understand your technique. He even says at one point in the series, like, I went to college for a semester, so I understand Freud. He literally says that, but it's like reminds me of what you're saying. But okay, so the symbolic eye, I feel like, is what we're talking about here, what we've built
yes,
to. We're back at I, and now we have the I U dyad.
yes. Because what is I? Is it the same thing as the ego? It's definitely not like a philosophical ego. It's something else entirely different that Freud was working with. Because the ego in philosophy has some type of agency, or it's like the I think, therefore I am. But yeah, like we were saying, there's this I-U relationship, and it's like the U is in the I
And
depends upon the other.
he says earlier in the seminar that the you exists in the unconscious before the I is even crystallized.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
is how primal, was prehistoric,
Yeah.
this
And
you is.
and it's only the I could ever formulate through the mirror stage. And even right here on this page, when he says about like the orders, desires, which he must recognize, his fathers, mothers, educators, his peers, and mates, everything. I wouldn't say strictly outside of himself, because it's like now we're talking about, it's like the problem of the blurred lines of the in-welt and umwelt, right? The inner and outer world. But in a sense, it's like the you is already in the I before the I could even realize itself. They're not realizing, they only realize themselves in reference. Like the mirror stage, the baby realizes their image, but it then becomes like in reference toward the mother child dyad before the secondary narcissism or alienation can take place.
Would you say that something like a proto-ego, and I think Hippolyte talks about this in reference to the Freud article essay that he analyzes, that there's a pleasure ego and that it in a sense predates the formation of the I? Can one have an ego without forming a sense of the I?
Um, that I'm not sure. And if he talks about ego, like if there's a sense of I, the I is again a linguistic thing. So the I would exist insofar as language and speech are at the disposal. Like we talked about, like in one of the beginning chapters in the topics of the imaginary, like how little Dick didn't have speech at his disposal. Like he was like not an idiot. He was a master at language, but he didn't know how to speak properly or communicate things in an appropriate manner. Therefore, you know, things like saying like I am hungry, I am sad, I want this. And it's always again evoking the you or a listener. So I would say that the I, as if it is the ego in mediation of speech, is different than this pleasure ego, which this is more of like purely imaginary identification with this lure, but also through these lures, you're in this caregiving position, or you're in the position of being cared for by the mother function, that which brings immediate satisfaction to the libidinal, you know, instincts or drives. So that type of pleasure ego is that satisfaction, which then becomes lost through language and the introduction or admission into the symbolic.
Right, because what he says here is the I is constituted at first in a linguistic experience in reference to the you. But what's fascinating is that the identification with an I in language does not, although it creates the illusion that this is happening, it does not partition off the outside and the inside in the way that we imagine the outside and the inside are separated in everyday life. They're
Yeah.
still very much entangled. And that is where desire loses itself, in that entanglement. And this is what analysis wants to address, in a sense.
Yeah. No, most definitely.
And this is what he's saying here. What makes the individual unhappy is not understanding the precise point of resonance
Yes.
where they subsist. And I really like the way he phrases it here, which is that we jump forward in time to adulthood, and what is revealed is that none of the true enduring problems of childhood are really purely resolved through the Oedipus complex or through castration, but they just persist in a different way.
Yeah,
And
and this is like sublation right here. This is the dialectic of like you never come totalize and synthesize, rather those contradictions of different affirmations and negations simultaneously sublate into different form. Anybody who's listening right now could agree that, like, you know, if you're above the age of 18 and, you know, like, you know, have a job or going to school or whatever, just living your life as an adult. When you're a kid, you're like, man, I freaking hate high school. I hate my parents. Like, I just can't wait till I'm an adult and I can move out and things are going to be much better. Like, I'm going to be in control of everything. Like, all these things, I am going to be in control of everything. You know, I'm going to have this and that. I feel this. I feel that. I know what I want. But then when you get there, then it's like, oh shit, nothing planned out the way I wanted it to, or it's just like you weren't expecting all these other things to come, you know, and hit you like in your blind spot, whether it's like debt or bills or just relationship issues that are more complicated, just all these different things about being in adulthood that make you think like, oh, being a kid was a lot easier. And now I'm thinking back about all this stuff. So it's like you're still feeling overwhelmed by all these different contradictions of being alive as you did as a kid, but you were like blaming it on like, oh, I just hate school, I hate my parents, but it's like, oh, I hate like my boss, I hate my landlord, like I don't know, like just all these different things that the problems are still there, that you're not feeling satisfied, you are still lacking, and like your desire is not met.
not met in as much as it isn't recognized,
Recognize, yeah.
least of all by you as the patient, which is what's interesting. What of himself he is capable of securing recognition for, that's what he isn't able to localize.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that point in himself where his desire exists, where it expresses itself, not in the form of a specific object, but as a pure form. And that's what we're building up to, the pure form of desire. Ignorance.
Yes.
Right? We have love, hate, and ignorance.
And it's interesting that he says ignorance. It's like ignorance of what though? And
exactly.
And then, or is it like the ignorance of them both? Because there are some instances where there's like this ambivalence of love and hate.
Well, what he says that's fascinating is that ignorance must be ignorance of something. So there must be an acknowledgement of something of which one is ignorant. And this acknowledgement brings with it a specific tone, quality, which would, in a sense, locate where this unknown is through speech. So ignorance is always ignorance of something. And if one knows they're ignorant of something, then it's almost like they've half identified the object.
It's very similar to what Zizek says about, like, what is it? The known knowns, the unknown knowns, the known unknowns, and the
Donald Rumsfeld. Yeah, he's quoting Donald Rumsfeld there.
Yeah.
A documentary by Errol Morris.
Yeah.
Where Donald Rumsfeld lays it all out. Maybe he's a secret Lacanian all along. Maybe Lacan inspired the Iraq War. Could you imagine? Donald Rumsfeld is, yeah, he does there kind of outline a very fascinating kind of dichotomy of
Lacan is the reason for the Iraqi war, just like for Theodore Adorno is like Hegel was the reason for the Holocaust.
That's right. Hegel was the reason for the Holocaust.
Such a bold claim.
Lacan is responsible for 9/11.
Yeah.
But yeah, so unknown knowns, right?
Yeah.
Very useful concept. And here we have, gosh, I don't know where I would identify it in that kind of fourfold distinction, but would it be a known unknown?
Yeah, if you know that you're ignorant of something, it would be a known unknown.
It's a known unknown that we're dealing with here. But he says, careful, we're beginning to get deep into philosophy. God forbid.
God forbid, yeah.
This is the problem Zizek has with Lacan, is that he's not Lacanian enough. He doesn't own his ontology.
Yes, yeah.
And I think at one point Lacan says something like, "Do I have an ontology?" I guess so.
I guess so, yeah.
It's like, God damn it. Come on. But misrecognition is not ignorance.
Yeah, that's the main thing that we're building up to. It's like, yeah, we're talking about, there's ignorances of something, but it's like at the end of the day, what we're dealing with is misrecognition, which is not an ignorance, but rather something of inversion and allure, which moves us. It's like it's almost illusory. Maybe it is illusory, but it's not because we're ignorant of it, because you can even say that, like, oh yeah, you know, even being interested in Lacan, we already know about the mirror stage. We know about our symptom to an extent, or theoretically we know about our symptom. But on a personal level, we're still under misrecognition because we can never identify that. We can never really get through that until we get deep into the analysis.
And the metaphor he uses is really interesting here. But first, I want to point out the organization of affirmations and negations. I almost take that as a kind of strategy, almost as if the ego is a kind of coping strategy, right? You need it is efficient. It has its defenses are what allow us to get through life, to survive, but also to enjoy until we can't enjoy.
Exactly. And it's like, it's definitely not some like evolutionary mechanism that allows us to handle, the struggles of life, or like these vicious predators, or like the way
No.
like freaking behaviorism or evolutionary psychology says. It's like, well, you're acting like this because it's like it's programming your amygdala. Like when a lion comes, like you react in this way because you got like a huge parking ticket and now you're in debt. You're reacting in the same way like that. Like it's like, no, it's totally not the same thing.
No.
It's not aggression, it's aggressivity. Which is part of this like resistances. And it's interesting though, like, because if we talk about like these defense mechanisms, what was said like a while back was that transference happens outside of the session, but it's only resistance that is made known or of use in the session. Like outside of the session, we're always transferring, we're always mirroring each other, but resistance has a special place in this. And I think that's because like the defense mechanisms are really brought into light, really sublated, in the sense that they are amplified, not like necessarily reduced down, but like amplified more before they're reduced down to a final core. Or
is that because, as he says before, speech is robbed of any of its strategies, essentially, which would, because in everyday life transference does occur, but as he says, feelings are always reciprocated. So long as they aren't reciprocated, then it's as if all of the different mechanisms at work in speech are brought to a halt. So there's no way out, no exit in the Sartrean
no
way.
exit. Yeah,
And therefore the resistances are the symbolic coordinates in a sense. Right? Like, would you say that like correspond in a sense to the symbolic coordinates of someone's reality, or am I going too far there? Might be.
I'm not sure if resistances would actually be some of symbolic importance. I think it is still on the level of the imaginary in maintaining this type of wholeness. Because it's the symbolic that has, if I'm not mistaken, more of those fragility that lead to the real. You know, I don't know. I could be wrong, but I always, for even reading Function and Feel, it's more of the imaginary aspect or the ego that has resistances, regressions, frustrations, and overall aggressivity.
And then we have here, this is the metaphor he uses that I think is really fascinating and reminds me of Verneinung.
Mm-hmm.
The person who lives in a state of misrecognition about the death of someone close to him.
Yeah.
We shouldn't think that this person thinks in a like Weekend at Bernie's kind of scenario that Bernie is actually a living being. Maybe Bernie's not the best example, although he is, because he's sort of undead. Bernie dances when music plays. I don't know if you know Weekend at Bernie's. Or
No.
it's a lame movie from the 90s. I'm dating myself with this.
Yeah, one of the
Example,
first.
but it's about this guy who's dead, who needs to. I forget the exact plot, but I don't know. His nephews or something need to pretend he's alive, so they hatch this series of schemes to kind of prop him up and put sunglasses on him, and then but for some reason he starts dancing when the music starts playing. He's very much undead. But here we have something similar. All right, let's jettison the Weekend at Bernie's comparison. But it would be wrong to believe he confuses him with a living being. So it's not that he thinks he's alive, he misrecognizes or refuses to recognize that he's dead. And this is kind of like Verneinung in that there's like a third term that is generated here, which is neither mother nor the opposite of mother, but not mother. So neither living nor dead, but something undead. And it's not a synthesis of both sides. It's not even a middle ground. It's this third, what would we even call it? A third.
Yeah.
Kind of generated here.
And when you're talking about this undead thing, I don't know, it just makes me think it's like, are we getting closer and closer to Drive or Death Drive?
Well, he does mention something of the sort a little bit later on. He kind of here returns to a distinction he made earlier about the Umwelt, the Gestalten, and how for animals, the imaginary structuration and its mechanisms are already set in place and set in stone.
Mm-hmm.
And the animal who is endowed with this innate knowledge does not need to represent their own bodily image to themselves in order to pursue these certain paths of discharge.
Yeah.
Whereas for the human being needs the prosthesis, the add-on of this image in order to function.
Exactly. Yeah. And like we said, like, yeah, the animal, like in the last one was the German title that we cannot pronounce. Well,
Zeitlich Entwicklungsgescheite. I've been practicing.
Multiple lures, but it's never fixated on one. Right. But us, it's like we need this like morsel of an image, to pretty much function.
Right. And that's what's interesting. It's not just the bodily image that that I can see right now with looking down, but if I choose, it's what we've talked about before. The gym bro looking in the mirror. If he chooses to focus on one muscle group, he's also focusing on something that hasn't yet come to obtain within his physique.
Yeah.
Right? That's what's fascinating. It's still something on the horizon.
Exactly. It's literally what my homie Brevin was saying in my communications class. So it's all about self-esteem and your self-concept of yourself.
All about self-esteem, but continue to improve all the time. But
yes,
be proud of yourself, but never stop improving. Remember,
unlocking unlocking your
never,
unconscious biases.
you've never reached the horizon of your potential, but be happy with where you are. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are two completely contradictory injunctions. Impossible to resolve. Hence the schizophrenia of our society. But anyway, he talks about the mirror stage here.
For those of you that don't know, Brevin is some type of social communications theorist that wrote a textbook that I have to study for my comms class, and it's very, very. It would make Lacan just like vomit.
if Andrew seems at all dejected today's episode, this may be why, you know, when you subject someone as brilliant as Andrew to such mediocrities, it's like being lashed with a wet noodle.
The only thing you need to work on is just your communication and just unlocking your unconscious biases and your cultural upbringing. That'll make you.
Yeah. And for our viewers, remember, we could be completely wrong about all this. This could be complete charlatanry, and it's all about unlocking your unconscious biases, and just a few HR trainings will do the job, you know? So you can turn this off right now.
Yeah. Or you could just continue watching and learn how to think with your feet.
Yeah, bitch. Sorry, the symbolic bitch, not whoever. Yeah. What I forget about this part. He's calling out this guy, but he's kind of like actually kind of giving him props. And now we're getting back to introjection, and we have a little hint of the superego. He's been dangling the carrot of the superego.
Oh yeah, this guy that he was like ripping on was like some like social theorist or whatever that like had like a film of somebody like in the mirror stage but didn't even recognize the importance of what was going on. Like there's something more profound in the behavior.
Right, and there's a filmmaker who captured something having to do with the mirror stage.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much it. It's like nothing too important, but he's just like emphasizing like this is like what I've been building you up towards, and like let's look at how it functions and look at how like people could just like overlook these important key phenomenon things in the mirror, or the baby obsessed with the mirror and dancing in front of it, or like being, you know, amazed by it, lured by it.
Exactly. And then we get one of his sort of poetic literary asides that is obviously designed to impress, because he's name dropping
La Rochelle
transubstantiation, right? He said kind of even disses Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Saying that this Balthazar Gracian is superior. Something about the introjection and how the superego comes about via introjection, but I think what he says, we're going to get into that a little bit later on. But this idea of introjection is very pivotal, because
I mean, and he's talking about eating eating the body of Christ or whatever.
Transubstantiation, you could eat Christ's earlobe by mistake.
Dainty earlobe.
Which
But
kind of
like, I just thought
reminds
that
me
was
of
funny.
it kind of reminds me of Totem and Taboo and the what are they is it the totem meal or he talks about the meal and the like eating of the divine, I think.
Yeah, and
The
like it's part
totem
of
meal.
yeah, like it's like about like all these different rituals, like pre-Christian, pagan, pre-Manichaeanism, whatever. There's always these rituals of consummation or libations, and it's like when you consume the divine, you invoke it within, and like what this shows, and especially like if you look at like different like what is it, Voodoo or Hoodoo, where they do what's called writing, where they get possessed by the spirits and they eat from the altar, but it's like they take on like the not only the identity but what the symbolic structure of this being entails. So it's like in the way that we function through the symbolic order, it's like we introject and we are consuming the master signifier, I guess, or the superego, and then take it upon ourselves to act out in the world as its vessel.
And it's as if, introjection begins in the imaginary, but this almost feels like a symbolic rehearsal of something that
Yeah,
began in the imaginary. That's he's not trying to focus our attention necessarily on that yet, but because we're anticipating
yeah,
the symbolic here, I think he uses that metaphor in addition to attempting to impress. But
yeah, and especially eating the bread and drinking the wine at like church. It's like it's always a rehearsal. It's always you trying to take in more of Jesus and taking more of God. It's like you have to be able to, and especially if you want to be, because you mentioned Nietzsche, if you want to mention Nietzsche about it, like um, guilt and ressentiment that repress the life drives, or that the drives that are affirming in the world of power, like par excellence. It's like this is like an example of like how the superego, is internalized in us through moral values or the values of Christianity. So it's like in a sense, it's like we're now we're putting it in a psychoanalytic context, but the consummation and transubstantiation of the superego takes place in the same kind of manner, it seems like.
right, because the superego is inherently it is a symbolic voice if it's the voice of the father.
Yeah,
It
it's the
has
law.
symbolic echoes.
Yeah, it's tyrannical law.
So he talks about transitivism here and how a child who might have hit Francois would say it.
Yeah.
Francois hit me. What's interesting about this is it reminds me of how like adults will say, I don't care who started it,
Mm-hmm.
when kids get into a fight. And yet adults go to trial about things like that. Like he said, she said, who started it kind of thing. And like
Yeah.
millions of dollars are lost. People are imprisoned because of who started it. But when it comes to kids, it's like it doesn't matter who started it. And
Yeah.
part of that might be like this kind of transitivism where it's kind of like you can't really ever in situations like where people where a child is still very much a creature of the imaginary determine who started anything because there's no clear demarcation that would separate.
That's interesting. That's a really good example. I never really thought of it like that's good.
Just occurred to me. Uh,
That was a bar right there.
I don't know. It's just signifiers. They outrun me.
Yep.
I don't know what to say. This is what you were talking about before. You mentioned agencies,
Yeah.
like higher agencies,
Oh yeah, because now we're talking about again ego and the id.
and it gets confusing here because it's he later is going to use the word envelope,
Mm-hmm.
and he's talking about the form as it's defined by its surface and the image of the other's form is assumed by the subject. So I
This
feel,
seems like it's very much foreshadowing the purloined letter
how so?
with the envelope. And
Okay.
like it never really matters which one is which. And it's like the switching of the envelopes, the person like takes the envelope from the queen without them looking, but one person notices and then has to like sneak in to switch it with the fake one. I don't know.
But
I'm just
it's a kind of pure form though. You're right, because the
yeah, it's
letter
like a
is
pure form. Yeah.
a a pure form upon which is projected,
Yeah. And
um, inscribed
I'm
certain.
talking about like the purloined letter in Essay in the Decree versus the purloined letter talked about and even more elaborated, apparently a lot better, according to Todd McGowan in Seminar 2.
Oh, then the essay.
Yeah. Because apparently that's the one that like Derrida deconstructs is the one in the essay one in the Decree.
Derrida deconstructs Lacan's essay.
Yeah, which is that one, the purloined letter.
Huh.
But I think what Todd McGowan was saying is like if you would have actually like read the seminar version, it would probably align to what Derrida was trying to get at and trying to prove Lacan wrong. It's like, no, Lacan actually was proving you wrong, son.
Damn.
And it's kind of funny too, like not to get out too topic, but one last thing is like even like somebody like Chiesa, who was first like a Derridian, he said that you couldn't find any, deconstruction of the text in Lacan. This is the only like thinker that was like
Who?
non-deconstructible.
Yeah. See,
Yeah.
it's because I was just listening to McGowan talk about how he thinks that the Agree can. I don't want to misquote him, though. I don't think he's saying you could ignore the Agree altogether, but he just doesn't understand why Lacan writes the way he does, and he was relating it to Lacan's perversion. And they were talking about, this was the episode of Machine Unconscious where it's Lacan avec Guattari.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's really good. It's a really good discussion. It's cool to listen to all those guys together. But he's talking about how, Guattari's diaries recount how cruel Lacan was. And, apparently he was a huge asshole,
Yeah.
but he was perverse in his way. And his writing reflects that perversity. That's how McGowan interprets it, that there's something perverse about the way he writes because it is so difficult to understand. It is so torturous to read
Yeah.
just one sentence of Lacan. He never makes it easy deliberately. And
But yeah, when he
this
speaks,
makes me
it's like
think of,
it's so different.
when he speaks, it's a little bit different, but who knows? It's like there's something admirable about the fact that, as you said, it's like deconstructible
Yeah.
from a Derridian, or how you say it,
Yeah.
point
The
of view.
reading.
It's like, yeah, it's deconstructible, first of all, because, yeah, it's painful to read.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I haven't read anywhere near as much of Lacan as McGowan, but I'm not sure that it's worth foregoing all of his written works. There might be something to it, to that struggle that is important for understanding Lacan.
I mean, I think with like overall is like as far as like each essay seems to tie in with the certain historical period of like when each lecture was taking place. So it's like with like the one on regarding the treatment of psychoses, like that definitely takes place during the time of the psychoses seminar. So it's like read that one. Or function and field, read that with seminar one, like we're doing. Or like obviously he's bringing in the mirror stage, so you want to go back to the mirror stage because it aligns with this topic. It gives you better understanding. Don't try to read it cover to cover, like a regular book, because it'll just torture you. It's perverse.
Yeah, exactly. It's a labyrinth that he
Yeah.
wants to take you through. If you get out, the other side, which won't happen, then you're the man. But
Yeah.
no one's the man. That's the whole point. Because there's no mastery.
There is no
the phallus is a fiction. So
exactly.
all right. So we're talking about the form which lacks a surface, a form defined by the surface. This is something that eluded me when I first read, or not read Lacan, but learned about the mirror stage, which is that we're talking about a form, not so much the contents of the, let's say, ego ideal. We have the ego. The ego is made up of different contents, but the ego ideal is a pure form, wouldn't you say? Or no?
The ego ideal being a pure form?
Like in a dialectical sense, it's structure.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I'd have to think about that one.
Let's go back to the bodybuilding guy admiring himself.
Yeah, like it's
What
a
he
virtual
wants
image.
is not a thing. It's only in potentia that it exists. So I'm thinking of the virtual image is not necessarily a specific image that can be visualized.
And it's definitely not him looking at the mirror and seeing a virtual image right there. Rather, that in a sense can bring him back into a kind of primary narcissism. But the ego ideal could be is like he's looking at his arms as he's doing dumbbell curls, hogging up the dumbbell rack, but he sees somebody behind him while staring at his reflection behind him in the reflection of somebody like benching, and they're just like built like traps, like literally no neck and everything. And that's like the virtual image of like what he wants to be.
In that sense, it would have a specific shape.
Yeah. And then therefore then he's like, oh shit, now but he should probably hit bench, but instead of hitting bench, he's like, I'm gonna hit curls faster just because I'm gonna be arrogant. That's his reaction, his resistance.
The performance of
his performance, yeah, failure.
So I guess there's some ambiguity about this idea of form for me. This chapter is seemingly easier than the last one, but it's tricky in its own right. Man knows himself as body. This is what we were saying before. Yes, the animal is inside of a body, but he doesn't need to know.
Yeah.
The animal doesn't need to know that they're inside a body to be what they are.
Yeah, and it's us that's why, like, again, narcissism isn't an identification with one's own biology or biological functions. Rather, it's like it's an image it's a spectacle that alienates you. So it's like we're going through two alienations. We have to, in a sense, identify ourselves with the body, but that's only because we continue to think about ourselves in relation to the image of the body. But it's only the image, but not the body itself. You know, we can never know the body itself.
Because of this seesaw movement.
Yes.
Because it's, I saw.
Yeah.
And
but there is some, again, utility within this mirror stage in the ideal ego, primary narcissism, because there is not only this misrecognition and sense of mastery and anticipation of mastery, but we kind of have some unconscious control of our motor functions with it. So in a sense, that's where we also have a misrecognition of it being our own biological body, but really it's not. Because we don't have control over our immune system. It works on its own.
Right.
It goes on its own. We're breathing on our own without us having to say, I am breathing for me to breathe. That's all happening on its own. Now, if you say, I choose to eat fucking Taco Bell every day, and then we're constantly getting sick or we're having diarrhea, then it's like, oh yeah, you know, it's your body's reaction to that. It's like, you didn't choose your body to react like that. You chose to eat like that. That's because you chose to, like, you know, live an unhealthy lifestyle, which is totally different. But you don't have control over your body in this duped way that you believe you do. Because you know, and in a sense, this is kind of like a very nuanced way of a mind-body dualism, like a Cartesian one, but except we're not Cartesians. We're not on this like I think therefore I am, but it's like this reorienting. It's the displacement and decentering of the ego, insofar as we can call it. Like, we're getting too far, or I'm getting too far because I'm thinking of seminar
Oh, this
two.
is good. This is good
Yeah,
though.
yeah,
Yeah, this is really good.
yeah,
You made me think of something though that I'd never made that connection yet, like with motor functions.
yeah.
Can you explain that again one more time, like representing motor functions for ourselves in a
Yeah, like and look at like with the wolf kid, like remember he wasn't in the mirror stage, he had no understanding of like himself, or like he didn't have an ideal ego. Like every time he saw his reflection, it was something outside of him, and he acted in aggressive, and he had um like maybe aggressivity, but I would say more aggression because he started attacking the image. It was like almost on this pre-genital um masochism type thing that he was going through, um, because he wasn't situated in this mirror stage. And that's why he had to do what he did of like tying the rope of the bucket, and almost like, it was like an umbilical cord, the bucket of water, and he was covering himself with it and holding Rosine Laforte's hand. It's like he's trying to do these weird gestures that indicated him being thrown into the world, so then he could go through some type of mirror stage and have this dyad relationship, which would then, like he said, over time he had better, like he said, like they said, his IQ kind of increased. He was able to control his bodily functions, because remember, he couldn't control his bodily functions. He would always like urinate and defecate, and even suffered from like what was like some slight cases of vertigo. And once this whole like ritual thing happened of his own creation, then he was able to actually have some symptoms of bodily mastery.
because he has a sense of the form of the body.
Yeah.
The container, remember the
Yeah,
container.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and not seeing things in partial objects. That partial
Hey,
body parts.
I hate.
That's yeah, partial drives or something. That's perfect.
Damn. All right, that's good. That was really good. Anything here we want to highlight?
I mean, if you want to mention Hegel, Hegel's always good. Hegel teaches us this. Then
Shout out to Hegel.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, like this again, we're talking about like alienation. Um, but at first, before language, desire exists slowly in a single plane. Yeah, just the imaginary function of the desire of, and it wouldn't necessarily be just desire, like desire structure like a language type thing in the symbolic order, but rather like the libidinal investment into the spectacle or specular stage of an alienated image. Um, but then that allows us to enter into these imaginary relationships, which wouldn't say Hegel is an imaginary thinker, but so far as there is this aggressivity between ego to ego, there's always this like failure of misrecognition, especially Kojev. It's going to be Kojevian Hegel, because we got to remember, whenever he mentions Hegel, it's Kojevian, but when he's not and he's being dialectical, he's the most Hegelian.
Right. And he's already said Kojev's thing, that desire is the desire of the other.
Yeah.
So at the most primal level, as Hegel teaches us, master-slave dialectic, the imaginary relation can only come to a head in mutual destruction.
Mm-hmm. Then we bring up St. Augustine.
Got another shout out here, only like 2 sentences apart, Hegel and St. Augustine. Shit's about to get real once both of these guys are in the mix.
Oh yeah, we'll hear it from St. Augustine again, and this
Big time.
Yeah, it's a big boy right there. It's a big name, the heavyweight.
So I think we were talking about this earlier. and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but what's interesting, and it's easy to miss this because the telos of becoming part, being incorporated, think about that word, like a body in the symbolic, tempts us always to believe that there is this totalized form. It's hard to train yourself to think otherwise. But what's fascinating here is that, yeah, so it seems like, okay, Oedipus vis-a-vis D&G is the kind of false culmination, totalization of everything, and that, yeah, their criticism of Oedipus is that it's too tied up with society and capitalism and the specific configuration of things, and a kind of let's say repressive apparatus. But I feel like there's a kind of subtle distinction that's going on here that can be missed, which is that what he says here, each time the subject apprehends himself as form in his ego, each time he constitutes himself in his status, his desire is projected outside. And what I took from this is that the closer you get to something like wholeness, the more alienated you become from your desire. I don't know if that has anything to do with D&G necessarily, but it's like Oedipus is always a failure.
Yes.
In a sense, ultimately.
Yeah, and this is
that's what I get.
It's a rivalry that never gets achieved. It always ends in a failure or a guilt, and this embodiment of the law based upon guilt and shame. Like the totem taboo, they kill the primal father, but sense of guilt that comes along with it, so they have no choice but to take the father's position. So it's never really the success they want, is actually ends in a failure.
Good point. And it's like, once we get there, once we assume the father's position, now we have to repent for the crime.
Yeah.
Even though when he was the father of the horde, we hated him.
Yeah.
Wanted him gone. And it's kind of interesting because it's the same thing with like regime changes, revolutions, whatever.
Yep.
You and me, we have an alliance. We crave upheaval. We want to overthrow the powers that be. But once we're in power, how can I trust you?
Yeah.
We know we feel like we did something wrong. Now what? And there's this sense of like the reverberations of the crime. It's like whenever you come closer to totalizing the image of your, according to your an ego ideal, the more your desire is projected outside and the more alien it becomes. And then he introduces this phrase, Verliebtheit.
Verliebtheit, which is a type of love, and it's actually like more of like a idealization love, like almost like in the sense of like a crush, but like a strong crush, in which it's like you have to like create so many I like an idealization, like you so many ideas and fantasies about it, and so that's like what the narcissistic investment of our alienated image is of ourselves. The ideal, or the ego ideal, is a believed hype, this sort of ideation or crush that we can never achieve. We're always in the friend zone of ourselves.
Always in the friend zone, perpetually. Damn. So the Verliebtheit is the friend zone. That's what it translates to, I think. That the cone of that you see in the original optical schema, that's the friend zone. The one in the other direction. This is but this whole passage is kind of confusing, a little bit all over the place, but it has to do with this perpetual reversion of desire to form and form to desire. And I think this is an easy thing to miss when exploring the idea of desire, Lacanian desire, is that you want to attach it to something, you want it to be this kind of discovery of, oh, it's my mother, it's my father, it's this moment when yes, it's made up of those like little pieces and parts, but when we talk about form, and I think I already said it, but I just want to reiterate it. When we talk about form, we are talking about desire. Form is empty, desire is empty. It's a pure form. And it makes me think of, I was thinking about this earlier today to bring it back to Zizek and the Freudo-Marxian parallel. Like, what is, let's say, just the commodity? When we do our cognitive mapping of our surroundings and look at a commodity, what makes something pop out to us?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, this is something that Zizek emphasizes. It's like, if you want to understand what ideology is, I think of it, it's literally that which makes an object stand in relief from its surroundings. So it's like, when we identify something as an object of desire that we want, it's already caught up in the commodity form in some sense. So that's why form is always emphasized and structure is always emphasized. And it also might be, not to overextend everything I'm talking about, what's kind of missing in phenomenology,
Yeah.
I think, and why structuralism is important, especially when it comes to the socio-political.
I think that's cool that you mentioned that too about the commodity. It's like, makes you think of like the way IKEA is structured in the path and the way you walk. It's like certain things will stand out to you in relief. The different decor and setup, like the aesthetic appeal. And it's just like, go here, right here.
This could be
and
you.
yeah. And what way to disavow it than go up to the freaking food court and have their Swedish meatballs.
The disavowal of Swedish meatballs. But the thought that I was having was like a book. Okay, so like, people like you and me, I'm sure we tend to think of ourselves as like not materialist in the trivial sense of that word. Like,
Yeah.
oh, we don't care about things, and like, you know, some people need a Ferrari to be happy, but we can be happy with our books. But
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
the thing is, I like the object of a book, right? Like, I
Yeah.
like the heft of a book. Like, I like flipping through pages. It's something about having a book, like finishing a book, whatever. It's different from like reading something on Kindle. Now it's
Definitely.
like, but if it's a book that I don't want to read, if it's a book that I think is shitty, I'm not going to see that object in the same way. It could be the exact same quality of production, the same paper.
Or like if
Suddenly
it's
it's a different object.
yeah, or what if it's the same book, but it's like the cover though, like the publisher company that has a better cover.
And then you're like, damn, they got it.
Yeah.
And then a good book with like a trash cover, you're like, what? Like, how did that pass?
Like obviously these seminars like this, like the cover is like all right, but like then when you get into
Yeah.
like when you get into like seminar 4, 5, and 6, like they got some like badass covers, and then like
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and then it goes back to just like this style, and it's just kind of like all right,
It's like, what happened?
yeah,
No, it's so true, because it's like, but that's the form of desire that you bring to a thing that can transform anything and then turn it, as Lacan puts it, I forget where, but make something like excremental.
yeah.
But I think we got like way like away from what we were going for here, and I think we're probably
We're
lingering way
towards
too
the
much in
end,
this chapter.
yeah.
Um, ends on this really terrifying note of like a child like crushing. Did he hurt? Did she like actually kill this other kid, or
I don't know if she actually
oh, like that
did.
was suggested?
Yeah, it was just like I think she just hurt him really bad, but it's just like this like thing of masochism because of like the alienation. It's like something in the I think it's in the not the pregenital plane, but in the sense it's like through this what she was trying to do was not hurt him, but really hurt herself. But in so far as she was still in this mirror stage through the I could be wrong if it's pregenital or the genital plane, that there's this like sense of masochism, or maybe it's called sadomasochism because you're hurting the other, but really you see yourself in that other in this pure spectacle, like this primary narcissism that's still forming. So it's almost like a question of like a death drive then, because it's like, well, you're developing yourself. If there is ego development, quote unquote development, or stages, especially if we're talking about Freudianisms with like, if they want to latch on to young, early Freud with the libido development of like oral stage, anal phase, all this stuff, you know, we'll think like there should be this progression, but it's like, why is it like in this stage that this kid is already undermining itself by definitely not committing suicide, but hitting the other person because of the aggressivity of seeing oneself.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what he says. Her first identifications were with this playmate, and she wanted to destroy the person who is the site of alienation.
Yes.
To destroy the alienation itself, and therefore gain a kind of mastery.
Mm-hmm.
I like this moment because he talks about the masochistic outcome of the mirror stage, and he's like, give me time. But then he's like, you know what? I'm going to answer this. I never fold when raised. Like,
yeah.
He's just like, I
but
always respond. Anyone calls me out.
Yeah.
I don't care who you are. I'm petty like that, is what he's saying.
Yeah. Call him Petty Kruger. But right here, this is where we get into Fort Da, right? This is where we talk about
this is where it gets tricky. So now we finally get to our first symbol or signifier, the genesis of the signifier right here. And he relates the primary masochism, the death instinct, which I don't know if we skipped over it or he says it in a bit, but this is what I was sharing with you before in my audio messages, that like this death instinct, or I guess it's like the early moniker for death drive, is the what I call the solution of continuity between culture and nature, or in this case, the imaginary and the symbolic. So how does one leap from one to the other? Well, the libido, but also death drive is what connects the two.
Exactly. And so it's like this brings a question, thinking about Seminar 11, in which Fort Da on the, is it Touche and the automaton, right? This repetition and almost something that happens by chance and like on its own, this reoccurring of the death drive, this masochism is really, it's something that not only links the symbolic and the imaginary, but also undermines it. And it's just a constant repetition for this mastery, even though it has this masochism aspect to it. It's a masochism in this chance of I will obtain mastery of it, this anticipation. But it's always unconscious. It's not like you're consciously trying to, anticipate something. And I just find it interesting because this is like the echoes of the real, because this is where drive is situated in Seminar 11 is the real, but we'll talk about death instinct or death drive in Seminar 2 as something of part of the symbolic.
So is masochism in this sense synonymous with repetition?
I think overall as a masochism is the undermining of the self, or undermining of oneself, like almost like death drive, but in a sense of like maybe what is being undermined is not necessarily like one's ego ideal, but of the ideal ego.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Why?
Because of the sense of wholeness, right?
But the ideal
not a destroying of something I might be one day, but something that I feel fulfilled at, something I'm whole at. It just disgusts me. So this thing of destroying it.
Right, because doesn't Freud have like the 4 definitions of primary narcissism, which is like something I once was, something that was a part of me, and
Yeah,
then when it comes to ego ideal, it's something I will be, right?
definitely, right. And right here, like I have this is a good book to get, like The Language of Psychoanalysis by Laplanche and Pontalis.
The
They say
dictionary.
that they has masochism, right? It says a sexual perversion in which satisfaction is tied to the suffering of humiliation undergone by the subject, but Freud extends the notion beyond the perversion in the definition of masochism as described by sexologists, and identifies masochistic elements in numerous types of sexual behavior and sees rudiments of it in infantile sexuality. But secondly, a deviative form, notable moral masochism, where subjects, as a result of the unconscious sense of guilt, seek out a position in victims without any sexual pleasure being directly involved. And I think right here we just have a primary masochism, though not in a sense it's moral masochism.
But it would be an undermining of the
Yeah,
ideal ego.
yeah, and because there's the primary and a secondary masochism, and I think what we're having right here, because it says right here, primary masochism in Freud understands a state in which the death instinct is still directed towards the subject himself, although it is still bound by the libido and fused with it. Such a term is termed primary because it is not subsequent to a period in which aggressiveness is turned upon an external object. And though it seems like with this person, obviously the kid got hit, it's not really an external object. It's rather just the side of alienation of
Okay,
the first alienation, the ego.
that's interesting. The site, right? So what's
Yeah,
being undermined is the place of
yeah,
alienation. It's not
of
like
identification. Yeah,
it's weird to relate it to like
it's
kids. Like
really
it's not like a BDSM kind of thing.
no, no, no.
It's like it's not that. It's like the place of alienation is what's being subverted in some,
Yes,
and that's what this vocalization of the phonematic opposition
yeah. Fort
becomes.
Dot as well.
So Fort Da, of course, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like a game that Freud observed his nephew, I believe, playing, where he has this cotton reel and he's throwing it. Is it over his cradle or something? The kid's in a
So
cradle.
he starts by throwing objects over his crib, but then like he sees him playing with a cotton reel, and then he's like tossing it. I forget where they're at, but he's tossing it and then bringing it back in. But it first started with like other random toys and objects, but then it turned to the cotton reel.
And he's tossing and then pulling it back.
Yeah,
Tossing, and I think I read recently Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he's tossing it over the cradle and then back. And Freud interpreted it as him representing his mother's coming and going,
yes, yeah,
essentially, and the child's attempt to master this coming and going by representing it for
yeah.
himself.
And it's funny again, bringing back to Seminar 11. It's like what he's trying to master is not necessarily the coming and going, but necessarily like mastering the trauma or the sight of this.
Right, the sight of it, exactly.
Yeah,
Not just, oh, I want to be God and control who comes and
yeah,
who goes and who, like, it's not about, yeah, assuming the position of God necessarily is like, yeah, exactly, the sight. And what's interesting is it's like the um zoned off area here has to be zoned off by language itself. The important thing is not just the game, but the words that accompany the game.
yes, yeah,
And this is where it gets tricky. There's so much here that you can endlessly analyze Fort Da, I would say.
yeah,
He enters the symbolic plane because only through language can the phenomenon of presence and absence be rendered. Without language, you're dealing with something like almost like a pure presence.
yeah, definitely.
language pokes holes in the immediacy of phenomena, and that is what allows a person to be a symbolic person. And yeah, like to enter the symbolic plane without absence, you have nothing. And this is what we talked to Brian Becker about, which is that like the realm of the signifiers is actually a realm of absences.
Yeah.
Now this is the second flex, by the way. It's like Lacan reading from function and field and commenting on it. He says, I found that it was comprehensible.
Wait, reading function and field or beyond the pleasure principle?
No, this is from function and field.
Okay.
Yeah, I read this recently. Like he's reading from function and field his account of Fort Da, his interpretation of Fort Da, or his interpretation of Freud's interpretation of Fort Da, and kind of trying to dumb it down because he realizes, you know, he knows that he writes in this specific way, and
it's just funny.
He says Jacques Lacan's texts.
Yep. Oh yeah. It's funny when he speaks about himself in third person.
It's like, yeah, Todd McGowan was saying in the episode of Machinic Unconscious podcast that he came from a Dada-esque kind of background where these kind of performative acts were necessary, and he's French.
I don't know why Todd McGowan doesn't think he's really like, he doesn't find him funny. I think he's very funny with like the way he like presents himself and performs. He thinks that he's not funny, but he thinks that Freud is actually a lot funnier. Because I guess it makes sense because Freud actually tells jokes. Lacan's not really telling jokes as much as he's just like being a clown.
But I have to point out something that McGowan says that's wrong. Lacan does tell it. It's not his joke, but he does tell a joke in Function and Field.
Yeah.
Remember, so Lacan does tell at least one joke at one point, and it's in Function and Field, and it's about like a lion eating a dog. It's like a little girl says to this man, like, "Oh, that dog that was bothering you, good news, he's gone. He was eaten by a lion who lives nearby." So there's a joke there.
Yeah.
But here we have to be really careful because Fort Da is really, it's complex in that, like, this is fascinating. It thus renders negative the field of forces of desire in order to become its own object for itself. So like you were saying, the site,
yes,
the field of forces of desire, you could see almost like a scene itself, the scene of absence and presence, coming and going, trauma, becomes something that's isolable, separated off from the flux of reality via language, and it almost gives breathing room to the subject.
And this is where we could talk about the scene of mastery as the repetition occurs in dreams and in the fantasy, but what's reoccurring in these instances of the scene is the encounter of the real in our attempts to master because of the failure of mastery, or to anticipate too late.
It's so cool. Fort Da's the shit because
Fort Da, that's what I said. The first mixtape dropping soon. Fort Da.
Absolutely. Dropping soon. What did you say the name of? Well, Fort Da is the name of the mixtape, or the?
Yeah.
You had something else though. What was it?
Was it Das Ding Effects?
By Das Ding Effects. That's our group. We're coming out with an album very soon. Gonna drop on the Theory Pleads publishing. It's gonna be an album, first album to be released.
Dangerous, maybe doing ad libs.
That would be sick. But yeah, so basically everything is contained here, and this is where I think he's so careful to build up to this sudden leap forward into the symbolic, because he doesn't want us to miss the dimension of death drive here.
Yeah.
You just be like, oh, okay, so the symbolic, angelically intervenes to save us from Hegelian master slave destruction. No, there's still a destructive element in language that carries over. It doesn't just pacify us or referee the exchange, but still, in terms of sublation, retains death drive. And the way it manifests itself is in the language is always repetitive in a sense. The way we learn signifiers, and we're going to learn this a little bit later on, the way we understand signifiers, how they can be used in a way that's like productive, is through a kind of repetition. That's not to say that signifiers are ever static or fixed. And this is how learning takes place, but it takes place through this primary masochism, which is this compulsion to repeat, which has to do with trauma. And the way it manifests itself is through, this is what's so easy to miss. It's not just, mastery is never achieved. Mastery is always its failure, and death drive is always missing its mark. That's what keeps it going. That's what keeps it satisfied, is it's the difference between goal and aim, right?
Yeah.
So here we have an aim, which would be, well, to bring it back is what you would think, right? Like at first glance, bringing the cotton reel back to here would be the goal. We want it back in the embrace, but you can't look at here or there as separate realities. They're coupled in that the act is one of coming and going. And what's happening is that mastery, sorry, let me get back to aim and goal.
Yeah.
The aim needs to be missed in order to reach the goal of keeping drive perpetuating itself.
Exactly.
So and it's kind of like the lure, right? It's always something artificial. It's always something somewhat arbitrary, unimportant in and of itself, but needs to be in the line of sight in order to in order to be missed, in order to be aborted, to bring drive back to its goal.
It's like the goal of the McFlurry machine at McDonald's is failure. It's like
if you get a McFlurry, it's always disappointing, right?
Exactly.
Because it's much more satisfying to go there, know that it's down, know that it's broken, and feel the kind of jouissance that comes from that disappointment. That kind of disappointment is better than actually getting the thing.
Yeah.
Being disappointed. I could talk about, I don't know.
I pretty much, we're just being, we should definitely just like close that in, just because of the fact that like we don't want to give too much out, because all this is going to get literally elaborated in seminar 11 when we really go into a whole chapter of Fort Da.
Okay, there's a whole chapter of Fort Da. So
yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's chill then. And I think we said enough about this.
EPMD, you got to chill.
Every polymorphous diversity must death drive. No, I don't. Nice, EPMD. Love EPMD.
Good name drop. I think that pretty much
about does it. I do want to say he brings back the verbal nucleus. This kind of has to do like the pathogenic nucleus.
Yeah.
Remember what he originally says, that it's made up of verbal forms
and ideations.
Now the ideational mass, now it makes a lot more sense. And what we try to do in analysis is cut people off from the moorings of everyday imaginary language in order to do what? What would you say?
Cut them off from their moorings. Like, it's like, and that's I think that's kind of cool, because like they're talking about like mooring. I was like, when you moor a ship onto a pier, right? But it's like ships are not meant to be moored all the time. They're meant to be out at sea.
Ooh.
Yeah. And it's like usually if a ship is moored, it's only for the crew to rest, but mainly also because something usually breaks down on the ship that it has to be moored. You know, whether commercial or military vessel, it's like if they're moored, it's because something's broken or there's something has to get maintained. You know, there's fragility in the machinic equipment. It breaks down. So it's like in the moorings of speech, which they think they're secured, but peer pressure, dad joke, it happens because of breakdown.
Gotta find a way to deal with the peer pressure.
Yeah, no, but like, you know, hopefully that metaphor makes sense because like even though they're more this like there's this breakdown, you know, of the speech, of the symptom, because you know the symptoms, as he says in Function of Field, the symptom is structured like a language.
You can get the ship going, what it was designed for, right?
Yeah,
But that the ship out at sea actually it's an anxious endeavor.
yeah, and it will have to get moored again. It is Fort Da because it even breaks down. It broke down and to begin with while running while at sea, so it has to go back to a port and moor to rehabilitate itself some way, only to go out again. It's like this compulsion to master the sea.
And so once the patient is unmoored,
Yeah.
we're able to extract speech from language.
Mm-hmm.
And what I take that as like the speech, full speech contains within it the moments of the subject's history.
Yeah.
And a kind of well, not necessarily chronology because that's too linear, but something like, yeah, the ideational mass of the moments of the subject, which have to do with these identifications layered into the ego that is the misrecognition of desire. And once the analyst is able to alienate their patient from these identifications, make them seem stranger and stranger, less familiar, then the exact form of their desire is revealed in some sense. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely, most definitely.
Should we take a 10-minute break?
Yeah, we would take a 10-minute. This next chapter is pretty short.
The next chapter is pretty short. I think we won't spend as much time on it.
Bulldoze through it. Yeah.
We do not quit. And it's flagging, but we'll try to keep this one a little shorter.
It's all good.
The fluctuation.
IPA.
I got another Heine. Another Heine dog. And we're at the fluctuations of the libido. Got Dr. Pujol in the house.
Pujol, who is this dude?
Just another rando. Trying for eternity.
Yeah. He's confused about desire. I think he's asking, like, is it desire of the other, as in, like, you desire that someone or you desire something in them? And I think that's what Lacan is trying to kind of elaborate on. Man's desire is the desire of the other, but of others' desire.
So he's going to try to explain what that is via the human object, which differs from the object of the animal.
Definitely.
Rehashing some of the points he made before, man knowing that he's a body, never completing it, perceiving it in a complete fashion.
Yeah. It's never, yeah, it's always fragmented and it's always distorted.
This is kind of like the parallax view.
Yeah.
We
Very
only
much.
get the parallax view of any specific phenomenon because we can never represent it in its entirety.
Facts. Big facts. And I think this is like the moment we've all been waiting for. Desire is the desire of the other. And like right here, we start to understand that here this struggle for life is something that is far more different than and he makes this weird like rhetorical remark of Darwin. He says, here we have a destructive and fatal relationship between human beings. Moreover, it is always there subjacent. Lots of things have been made to fit within this political myth of struggle for life. If it was Darwin who wrought it, that was because he came from a nation of privateers for whom racism was the basic industry. I thought that was really funny. But I think this is like also like a sneak diss on like Darwinian bros about like an evolutionary teleology. It's like the struggle for life and even the death instinct undermines that. But yet there's still like it doesn't mean it's like going to eradicate humanity. It's not this extreme. It's like, oh, we either move forward or we're all just gonna die out, and that's the Darwinian type of thing. It's like a species either dies out or they progress to the final stage. It's like, no, it's they're one and the same. That's the dialectic of life and death, and it's like this contradiction creates an antagonism that sublates itself into like different modes of production, modes of history, and in the sense, it's like this is death drive or the struggle for life in desire and the desiring of the other.
Right. So in a sense, Death Drive does reach a kind of equilibrium. It's not just the kind of, you know, death metal kind of destruction for destruction's sake.
No, it's not. Yeah,
Otherwise, everything would just reach a point of complete self-destruction.
and in some of those, that's cool that you brought that up because in some cases, something like that, like that's more of like transgressive in a sense that there feels like in this antinomian act there is wholeness, but it's really that could at sometimes create this sense of ideal ego only to reorient you back into symbolic. And I think this is like what Todd McGowan and I were talking about like how transgression acts as like something to reorient capitalism to make you productive in it a lot better in a sense because you have certain instances of transgression, and even capitalism can profit off of transgression.
It identifies what it was lacking in a sense through transgression, what needs to be taken up into it in order for it to perpetuate itself.
Yeah, I mean, look at the father of philosophy of transgression, George Bataille talks about like we live in unlimited experiences, but it's like through these transgressive sexual acts, the consciousness of limitedness or of limitation is that transgression of wholeness. And you can see that in a sense of like trying to fulfill this actually gets undermined.
So he uses that idea as an entree into this concept of aggressivity versus aggression, which I think in one of our first sessions you very incisively distinguished from between the two, aggressivity and aggression.
Because aggression is something that animals do. And it's not to say that we can't display aggression, but aggressivity is something that has existential detrimental effects of getting your place of mastery taken away from you, especially in relation towards the other.
Would you say it's any affect that defines an imaginary relationship of rivalry, but also subordination, usurping.
Mm-hmm.
So even something like pleading with another person could be a form of
Yeah.
aggressivity.
Yeah.
It's not just anger, it's not just violence, it's not just
No.
domination, but even, yeah, like debasing yourself or prostrating yourself in front of another person
Mm-hmm.
is in itself aggressivity.
Even in a sense, when people perform charity for the less fortunate and get off from it and thinking that they're doing good from it is in a sense a display of aggressivity in which they have the ability to maintain that mastery through that and always do that with those acts. They can never do any charitable acts outside of some type of organization that makes them feel as subject supposed to know or subject of mastery. Because when they're outside of that, they're lesser.
They're freed from
Yeah.
the charge of, they're inoculating themselves from the charge of being seen as just a self-involved rich person
Yeah.
because they care and they show it through
Mm-hmm.
pumping capital into a
And I
specific
think, in a sense,
cause.
like an example of like aggressivity and sort of like retaliation, not like physical retaliation, but just like that, like overall, like getting caught in the gaze in this imaginary relationship of when somebody calls you out on that, you kind of, I wouldn't say disavow, but you find some way to justify why that's not the case. Or like somebody has this fullness of mastery and anticipation in Christmas, families do it. But then you have that one like misfit kid that will literally undermine everything by like criticizing. It's like, y'all are some fake Christians. You really don't, aren't like celebrating Christ because this is the only time y'all pray, or like this is all pointless. Why can't we just give gifts every single day? Or why is this the only time that we have to like see the family? Why can't we see it any other day? Or like other nuanced stuff like, Jesus wasn't born in December. He was actually born in the spring. The whole Huey, was it Huey from Boondocks? Jesus was black. Ronald Reagan was the devil. But then there's that, like, in a sense, when you get that, the retaliation of like, well, it makes me happy anyway, so you should just be good and hang out with the family type thing. There's that position of losing your mastery. So then aggressivity takes place in that form as well.
And there are all sorts of outlets for that in our society that, and this is the inherent transgression, that are already built into it that keep the status quo going.
Yep.
So we're talking about the mediation of language here and how supposedly finally we reach this triumphant resolution of I and you, but it's not as simple as that.
No.
There isn't this very clear distinction that we can rely on necessarily just because we can finally label you and I
Mm-hmm.
in a specific way. It's supposed to be this ethical reality from a certain point of view, but at the same time, there's still an enmeshment that I think is something he wants to emphasize here.
Yeah.
That the symbolic function does not solve everything. It is not this deus ex machina. It it does, I guess, prevent destruction to a degree, but it also, you could say, accelerates another form of destruction.
Yeah. Most
Why
definitely.
a wider destruction? I mean, look at mutual assured destruction with nuclear fallout. It's like it's something that's always deferred until it isn't,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's a symbolic reality that led to that. So the symbol itself is actually the ultimate danger. Um, but I think deferment is sort of inherent in the symbol, in that it's like it always contains the the allure
Mhm.
of what can be secured, obtained through what it promises, in a sense.
Yes.
This is great. I love the way he puts this. I really like this. For the human being, the word or the concept is nothing other than the word in its materiality. It is the thing itself. It is not just a shadow, a breath, a virtual illusion of the thing. It is going very much against. Oh, miss. Sorry, having some issues here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I just can't
I
see you.
was so dazzled by that sentence that it destroyed my image.
Yeah.
That's what happened. Um, so this is very anti-Platonic, almost,
Yes.
I would say. It reverses the divided line. The thing
Oh,
itself, the form, the material is its materiality, and not in the sense of the interplay of atoms, constitutive little bits of material, but rather the word should be seen as material, and everything that we experience is almost secondary.
yeah.
And he's this is and this is the what I was just talking about with, to me, if I understand it correctly, an example of, not seemingly less dire than nuclear destruction, but the word elephant here has more destructive capacity than anything that can happen in nature, pretty much, because just owing to the fact that the word elephant exists in human language, human beings can do things to elephants that are unimaginable.
Exactly. I mean, and it's the same thing of like, the politicians and the PMCs like trying to talk about the working class without them being there and it being more undermining to the policies that they vote upon without their recognition or their hearsay, their representation. They're only being represented through words.
And but what just occurred to me, just to go back to this definition of the word or concept, is like, and we're not at the quilting point yet, but it's taken me a while to finally sort of make heads or tails of how it is that we can still congregate around a certain signifier, even if it means different things to us. And there's a political resonance in that, like, we always rail against inherent bias training and all that kind of thing, where it's like, as if, you inherit an entire suite of ideas that determine the way you see the world, and they're culturally determined. You see them as universal, but they're particular, blah, blah, blah. Like, the whole story. But it's like that same that same doctrine recognizes that, oh, well, a word for you might mean something different from me. That's a banal observation. We already know that one thing could mean something to you and another thing could mean something to someone else. Fine. This is a little bit different. It's like, yes, the signifier as it exists in your symbolic universe is going to have different connotations and different signifieds attached to it. But the quilting point of signifiers is where people congregate. They still bring different associations to it, but those quilting points are there. They are real. They're still somewhat unique to the individual, but we still recognize them as such because, like, America is America, right? America means many different things to many different people. The whole, and that's okay. But it's the empty form of it. So the signifier is in itself empty. It attaches to signified through a kind of repetition. But what allows it to be so potent is the fact that it's not always completely tied down, even if there are these quilting points. So elephant can mean many things despite its referent,
Yeah.
If we're talking about, let's wipe out all of the elephants in this jungle because we want to also get rid of the trees and speculate there, like build some shit there. So we got to get rid of all the elephants. Suddenly, elephant means something else. Elephant's a nuisance
Yeah.
in this
Becomes
case.
an obstacle.
It becomes an obstacle. It's not just this beautiful, lovely creature. Now it's an obstacle. But then if you're in PETA, then elephant is this creature that's worth fighting to save. And
in both aspects, it's like they don't have to be in the room for them to speak about them, whether as being an obstacle or a creature worth saving. And so in a sense, it's like it carries on that like empty form. But there's always that like stereotype of like PETA being just as violent and like they're weird,
right. People say it's a CIA conspiracy theater.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, exactly. Like you said, it's an empty form. And what's interesting about it is the elephants themselves have no say in the matter. Plus, they don't know they're elephants.
Yeah.
Which seems like a stupid thing to point out, but it's sometimes I reflect on that when I'm watching animals. I'm like, that bird doesn't know it's a bird. It doesn't need to call itself a bird in order to do what it does.
But as Hippolyte says, that's the Hegelian logic.
That's the Hegelian logic for you. Hippolyte, like, always trying to throw Hegel in there.
Yeah, man. Hippolyte's the fucking boss.
Lacan's like, is that a problem? Yeah, like, no. He's like, no, I'm just saying. It's like a Joe Pesci moment. Like, what? I'm here to amuse you. What? It's Hegelian logic. Like, what is that? You got a problem with Hegelian logic? No, just like the Hegel.
Yeah, look, I think Manoni is just like fucking trying to like.
Manoni over here. It was Manoni who said. No, it's like, yeah, that's how human politics come about. If men don't like animals, it's. I don't think they really. I don't know what this means exactly.
It's just the funny dialogue, though.
It's just these moments are so hilarious in here because I don't think like the only reason we could follow along is because we're familiar with this stuff. I would be as lost as they are. I'm not saying they're lost necessarily. It's just kind of like
the weird like
little
banter and sidebars that go on. It's just hilarious.
That's why I love reading this, yeah. And like they're trying to bring in politics, and here's it's all pre-political. Like Lacan never wants to talk about politics.
Nah,
think about Lacan.
But he'll mention like Marx every now and then.
That's true.
Yeah,
but like in a very not like he's interested in the concept of surplus value only insofar as it pertains to his idea of jouissance. He's all that concerned with the proletariat.
Yeah, although he was very much like welcomed by the Althusserians, and his Marxist group, which I thought was pretty cool.
I could be wrong. Actually, I'm speaking out of school here because like I don't know, I haven't read enough of Lacan, but I know what his politics consisted of.
Yeah, he's like kind of a normie, really.
Pretty much, but like he's definitely not a Marxist. But
no. He's definitely well read, though.
Yeah, but he's as well read as anyone who's ever lived.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say he read everything from Marx, but he knows a thing or two.
He points out something really interesting here that he had mentioned earlier, that a child sometimes will produce the most random of, I think what they call them, like syntagmatic words out of nowhere. So you never know the words a child is going to.
Yeah.
They might not make any sense. Like if sometimes. Why are they saying that?
Yeah.
What does that mean to them? It's like a signifier exists on its own in a completely impenetrable universe that somehow has some resonance for the child.
This is like flying in the face of Chomsky right here.
This is as far from Chomsky as you could possibly get. Thank God. We need to investigate our inherent biases here, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of struggling to relate this together because I didn't reread this chapter.
Yeah, no
Diligence here.
I think though, like overall, because we're still on page 179, right? Talking about like these weird syntax that the child brings up. It's like, I mean, think about it like with how did the wolf, I mean, the way the wolf child was his name, Richard, right? No, that was little Dick. Robert,
yeah.
and it's like how the wolf had that same type of thing for him, and yet it seems like with this, however, these weird kind of functions of random speech utterances or words or signifiers that are floating around end up allowing for like a structure for desire, at least, because this is like what we're getting into is like the mooring of speech now, like holding the ego. And I guess what I'm trying to say is like it seems like what's being moored is the ego into the symbolic, right? The mooring is the speech and the signifier. The signifier is trying to moor onto metaphor.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And this is the key word here, pact, in that language is not yet a pact for the child who's using certain syntactical elements at random. And once it's a pact, it's like, I don't want to say it starts to make sense, but things start to fall into place in the sense that, and this kind of relates to his Levi Straussian notion of language as a gift or an exchange. Once the pact is established, then language can become a form of exchange. And this is where the speech act itself comes into play.
I think that's right.
Represents that.
I think that's right in saying that, yeah, it is very Straussian. There's a lot of Straussian elements in Lacan.
Because you're part of the symbolic order.
Yeah.
Any symbolic order.
Yeah. Especially for the first two seminars, there's a lot of Strauss in Lacan. And right here he says, speech is the meal will whereby human desire is ceaselessly mediated by re-entering in the system of language. It's not just that we're admitted into this, like there's this constant readmission. But it's like, why though? How are we really why is there this constant re-entering? And I think it's because maybe of the real coming into it, or maybe just the fact that we try to find something that allows us to transgress, to have these moments of ideal ego, only to come back into the symbolic anew. In a sense, it's like, yeah.
No, sorry to cut you off.
No, I was gonna say, in a sense, it's like, is Lacan being Jungian in the sense about psychological rebirth, but not in like the sense of like you find the true self, but really you don't. You only have these instances of illusion of like mastered myself, and then you go back into the symbolic.
I think what it is that some symbolic order is kind of misleading in that the symbols are never really ordered. No, and there's a multiplicity of symbolic orders. So whenever you go out into the world, start a new job, or even just like are in an unfamiliar environment, you don't know what the symbolic regulations, you don't know necessarily what the symbolic framework is yet, and like what you need to do is make, how would I put it, synthesize, or not synthesize, desire needs to be in some sense adapted to the present framework,
Yeah.
mediated and remediated by the symbols that you encounter. And it's funny because it's like when you're nervous, when you're in like a situation where you're around a bunch of new people and you have to speak, for many of us we, just like a moment ago, like have a difficult time speaking, like we lose our words, we are at a loss for words, we can't express ourselves, and it takes some time to rediscover our footing, our bearing in that symbolic order. That's
Yeah.
kind of how I read this.
Yeah. No. I understand what you're saying. And like, and in that sense, like in the multiple symbolic orders, especially like when we're in a new area, new job or something like that, we're trying to more meaning, more these metaphors to make sense of everything, comparing and contrasting. And especially like I see that in the military as well, like when you go from like two different ships, like you go from a cruiser to a destroyer, or you go from like a small boy like a cruiser and a destroyer to like a carrier, a big deck, it's like it's all a new world to you, so you're trying to like latch on and more. And it's kind of funny because we're talking about ships now again, but some reference to everything to create like a symbolic order to it, because it's just all over the place, it's just all brand new. And it's funny too because it's also chaotic, it's hard, it's raw experience, especially being in that type of environment. So the most you could do is try to find some type of metaphor or simile to compare it to for understanding, not trying to be analytical about it. It's mainly trying to ground yourself into this symbolic situation.
And you can only work with the resources that are at your disposal already, that
Yes.
you've imported from another symbolic context. And then
Yeah.
you become really self-aware, embarrassed, did I sound stupid, does this make any sense, it, but that happens all the time, every day there's some kind of situation like that, hence the treachery and anxiety of the symbolic order. Now he talks about the libido again, the primitive libido whose object is the subject's own image, and then libido which is related to a genital object. When I think genital object, I think the phallus. I think of this ultimate goal, this ultimate like integration, that illusory integration into the symbolic order in a sense.
Yeah. And so it's like right here that I believe it's if this page or not, the next one. But we're going on to the topic of genital love, where he brings up the analyst Michael Bellint, and that this genital love is something of where what we do is try to create an object out of our love. We finally realize like what is being loved, the object of love, rather than this like pure dyadic relationship of mother and child in the mirror stage. Rather, it's more of this knowing you have something to love and that you can be loved as well. But I think what he criticizes him on is the fact that he keeps it mainly in the imaginary plane, because genital love is something that actually is created by Michael Belland. It's not something that Freud ever used or ever came up with.
I'm always a little bit confused when he brings up love. It always seems kind of to come out of nowhere. So I can't say that I totally follow all of this.
And think like overall love for him is just like this completion or satisfaction or unity. And in a sense, like with narcissism and transference love, there is this demand for recognition that never is fulfilled because it's always from the narcissistic point of view. And narcissism is lack because you have to have an idealization of yourself to fill the void. That in narcissism in its purest form as a mental illness is grandiose aspect of yourself, because there is no love. There's more of void, anxiety, and hatred. Like right here, and this is why I love this book, because it just lays everything down like point blank. But it says, like, for genital love is a term much used in contemporary psychoanalysis to parlance and designate that form of love achieved by the subject at the term of their psychosexual development, and achieving implying not only of the accession to the genital stage, but also the overcoming of Oedipal complex, at least. And that's also the thing too, is like with that, there's always this striving to overcome the Oedipus complex of the father, the law,
right,
to get back to this whole of completion of yourself and the object of love. It's like the law is always at odds with you in this genital love.
but you always try to achieve that for but also for the satisfaction of the Oedipal complex, because like you're still trying to fix your,
and I think the Oedipal complex actually
within that
further determines it more. Like, it is only through, like, I think the Oedipal that the I could be wrong about this. Like, this is what's weird about these, like, certain, like, sexual stage developments. But I think with the genital love is when also Oedipal rivalry takes suit. So it's like the genital love wants to overcome it, but it's like this rivalry in the Oedipus complex also further determines this genital love, because there's also this implication that Bellent talks about, of like, well, not even implication, but like this question of like, is this natural and part of the biological aspect, or is this something cultural? And I think the criticism that Lacan is making is that, like, you kind of stoop so low to only think of it as cultural or biological, and never think about the structural linguistic implications of it.
Yeah, it's almost like he anticipates anti-Oedipus. I forget which chapter this is, but earlier in the text, when he says something like, ask this tribe in the country what they think about Oedipus, they'll laugh at you or something. So he already understands that Oedipus is not this eternal archetypal triangle defined by this specific familial configuration, because being a good student of Levi Strauss, he would already know that there are different kinship systems in the world, and that this isn't like a Eurocentric.
Because with the Oedipus complex, it's like the main thing is, especially on the level of anthropology and the tribal aspect, it's the prohibition of incest is the main thing, right? Because the mother is the object of satisfaction.
Yeah.
And even freaking young bros forget this because they think that they've overcome Freud, but it's like there's Oedipalization in Jung as well, in these anima-animus things. But in these certain systems of kinship, other than of the prohibition of incest, you still have the male as the paternal, no, not the paternal, but like the patriarchal function in forms of the uncle, or like the mother's brother.
Even in like a matriarchal culture, there's like still elements of patriarchy that turn up when it's not necessarily the father.
Yeah, it's not the father that's supposed to be worshipped, but rather the matriarch's brother.
Like, there are no thoroughgoing matriarchies that are just like, oh, like women are in charge and no man has any status. It's like, no, there's always.
Yeah, it's just not the father.
It's just not the father necessarily.
Yeah, it's like, you're like, Maury, you are not the father.
You are not.
But yeah, it's really the the uncle, in some cases, the mother's brother that plays a more crucial role. Even like Merleau-Ponty in his child psychology and pedagogy, when he talks about different tribes and cities and societies, trying to see like the contradiction of Oedipus and how other people are raised, that in instances like there is still this patriarchal function, but it's never really just simply located in the father, but rather in the uncle, or even in the grandfather in some Native American tribes, in these certain rituals where they have to get the honor and recognition of the spirit of the grandfather, who's the seniority of the tribe. It's pretty interesting too. But it's like, it's not necessarily Oedipus, but it's not like it's against the patriarchal function. It just operates in a different manner.
Yeah, this part is a little tricky because there's a lot going on here. He brings back the desexualized libido, I think, in a tongue-in-cheek way.
Mm-hmm.
The swerving of hate into love.
Yeah, and it's like ambivalences and stuff.
Death instincts, life instincts, and
I think like right here, so like when we're talking about the Oedipal rivalry, right? it does happen on the imaginary plane, and then like right here, the ideal ego is an imaginary figure as much as is invested with the key term that we talked about in the last chapter, Verliebtheit, the crush.
The crush, right?
Yeah, the over idealization of yourself, or of this object of love, pretty much. And what makes it like, I think what's interesting about this word is like it not only is an idealization, but also makes it feel like it's not only just out of reach, but there are a lot of obstacles that keep you from, or that are prohibit you from enjoying this, due to Oedipus, due to this rivalry, because you're enjoying, right? If you get it, you're enjoying, but the law, the superego is inflated tyrannical function that says you can't enjoy this, that. If you do, you're guilty,
But it's also like I don't know if it pertains to what we're talking about right now, but the voice of the superego, it proscribes a certain kind of enjoyment, and in that act of proscription also nominates the enjoyment. So it's like you cannot enjoy your mother in this way.
Yeah.
And yet it tells you what the desire of the mother is, and telling you that it's wrong, prohibited, but it retroactively brings that form of enjoyment into being.
Exactly.
And I think that's what I know in further seminars is going to really get into that.
The main thing is more enjoyment, because like, prior Lacan, everything was repression, right? Repression and prohibition, but now it's more about what's enjoyable versus what isn't. And then not even what is enjoyable, but how you could further that, or how you are enjoying it wrongly, right? Like, you're not enjoying it the right way. There's a right way and a wrong way. Not to say it's like, oh, you're either enjoying or you're just miserable. It's like, no, there's this escalated form of enjoyment, like beyond like your imagination, and then there's just like, oh, you're just not enjoying enough. It's not cool. You're not part of the club.
And then when you bring your symptom into the picture, it's like, this is where he brings it back to language, and this is what's really interesting. It's like the framework within which the libido will fluctuate. So we got to get the libido going. We have a pact he says in the analytic relation, the two subjects are linked by a pact, but it's like the nature of this pact is unknown, because it's not like any other pact that exists in other places in society and other relations. So we have this pact that is ambiguous, it's hazy, but someone starts to talk. The analyzan starts to talk. The only thing they're encouraged to do is free associate, which is really an impossible task.
Really, it is.
What happens as they try to free associate to perform this impossible task is the moorings of speech are untied. And to be freed, it seems like it would be liberating to be freed of the obligation, not only to be polite or courteous or be coherent. That seems like something where you'd be like, sure, I want to just speak my mind, talk shit, not have to respect boundaries in the way I do in everyday society. And yet it isn't as liberating as you would think it is because you're not able to do it. I had this experience myself when I was in therapy. It's like I felt like I kept censoring myself, and I felt like I was, not that he ever told me to free associate necessarily, but somehow I picked up on that as the encouragement inherent in the dynamic. And it's like I remember feeling so frustrated by the fact that I couldn't free associate, that I couldn't speak my mind without censorship.
Yeah.
And I thought that, like, oh, well, I'm like this already outside of analysis in everyday life. And it's like, is this so ingrained in me that I can't speak freely? But it's a little bit more complicated than that.
I think you're actually like that's like a really good example, and obviously we need to make those examples every now and then to keep it kind of like grounded with the therapeutic aspect, because this is what we're talking about, the technique. And it's like when people's like, they're taking away our free speech.
Right.
But like, what is the free speech for? Like what is it that you feel unfree of saying, like some like bigoted remarks? But then it's like when you actually have time, like when you actually have that like space to say something freely, then you have that moment of censorship. Even in like so-called like safe spaces where we can talk free, like we have a safe space for us women, for us feminists, or we have a safe space for like this, like all black, or safe space, you could name it, like all these minority groups. And then like what happens is that there is this tyrannical superego that takes place in which there is a censorship. There is really no free associating or free thinking. Rather, it's a free space for certain things that have been repressed or rejected. And now that they have a point of speaking, it's like, no, they're actually functioning by prohibition or by censorship.
But because what's meant to emerge in the failure, in the tripping over oneself, hence like parapraxis, slips and everything like that, is the oscillation of desire. And I think it's that like entrance, exit, and re-entrance into the symbolic order constantly, where one reveals one's, if there's anything like individuality in human being, it is like the manner with which they like and enter into conversation and exit conversation.
Yeah.
And that's what is supposed to be tracked here. But of course, countertransference can prevent that because you still get fixated on what they're saying, depending on how interesting maybe you find your
your
patient in a sense.
Oh yeah,
Or yeah.
Yeah, for the countertransference to happen. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But I like the way he says it here. The uncoupling of his relation to the other causes the image of his ego to fluctuate, to shimmer, to oscillate, renders it complete and incomplete. So he recognizes all the stages of the desire, all the objects which have given him consistency, but this is a process of self-alienation, of self-estrangement.
Yes.
That is the constitution of his ego, but it's got to be a really uncomfortable, if not traumatizing sort of experience to trace one's own self-constitution in this manner and
of speech.
and always speech in language. That's the thing. Speech extracted from language. It's not to say the problem with no, well, you tell me if this is true with Jung. It's like archetypes are language, but it's like a static system, right? In a sense,
I
or
wouldn't even say archetypes are languages. Not at all. Archetypes are images. They're imagos, and that's going back to on narcissism essay, or not on essay. The the lecture in this seminar on narcissism, where we get the rivalry of Jung and Freud. At the end, Lacan says that in Jung there is a confusion between the symbolic and the imaginary with him, and he takes these archetypes as images, not as something that is in a linguistic crisscross or in a sort of sense verneinung. Rather, they appear not only in their projections, which is imaginary, but also in dreams and certain motifs, be it mythic like Hercules, going in the underworld or whatever. It's not like that this archetype represents Hercules. No, it's like, oh, it's very common, just like the myth of Hercules. It's just like comparing it. But rather, it's like there is this image of yourself that keeps repeating rather than like a linguistic failure type thing or like a parapraxis. I think
right,
that's the difference. Yeah.
which is
Because the
like false
complexes are,
mentality.
they're impulses of the imagos. And he'll use that term imagos over and over again. And,
But
and rather, like, even with that, it's like it's not the failure of the ego in empty speech, in this deformity for full speech. It's just the unconscious coming into light, because the ego to Jung is a fact. He's a fact simp.
and then here we have this. I like this idea of a maximal narcissistic projection, which is like what ultimately emanates from the breaking of the moorings of speech.
Yeah.
And to put it plainly, kind of like how you view yourself being seen by the other
Mm-hmm.
is how I interpret that. And then there's this the love that it is invested in the image. Maybe I'm mixing too many ideas together here. I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, what is it? You're talking about Verlieb
The
type?
crush.
Yeah, yeah. It's just like this being enamored by the image and like being drawn in, and it's like this further idealization.
This is simping right here in a
Yeah,
sense.
it's literally just simping.
This is the simping. Yeah,
You're
this
a
is
Verliebite.
being a simp. Yeah, we finally found the German for simping.
The German Sims. That's good. Yeah, it says being in love, what it happens in an entirely different way. That's funny. uh
Um, and then he gets into a discussion of Dora and the subject's identification at the level
oh,
of narcissistic image. This is when it starts to
I
click.
was yeah, I was reading this morning. It was really interesting about like how there's really in the failure of this thing of this treatment by Freud, what Freud was getting at was something more than just what balanced development of a primary genital love, but rather something more symbolic, especially in this countertransference. But like, was Freud wrong for his countertransference because he kind of saw something really where it wasn't like this love of really Frauke for this like imaginary qualities and what she represented, but also as far as the signification of the father and the father's love, the father being more symbolic, but rather signifying Frau K. And so in the transference, Freud took on those characteristics of Herr K, the father, and there was that symbolic affection, and that's why like Dora kind of was in this transference. Dora was having this erotic transference and like ended up leaving. I mean, this is kind of like a simplified version of it, but this is what he's trying to build up at. There's something more symbolic and structurally than just this back to a primary love in the genital plane, which is purely imaginary.
Which, so he's saying, because he gives Balint his props kind of
He
for,
does, yeah. He's getting to something, but he just doesn't. He stays in the imaginary overall.
but he thinks that Balint's like, because Balint sees a genital love as a attainable, completed state, right?
He thinks it's attainable, but I think what Lacan is getting at is he's right into saying that there's this feeling of like wholeness that we could get in this thing called general love. But I think what Lacan is trying to say that it's not attainable, that it's ultimately leading to failure.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where Balint gets it wrong.
Yes.
All of these, they all miss the dimension of failure.
Yeah.
Which
Or
is
just
so
or even like what situates imaginary relationships overall. Because again, two bodies. We need a third. Mediation.
So this is fascinating, and maybe one day we'll read Dora's case. I'd like to do a whole series on like case studies.
History cases, yeah.
Dora,
Wolfman, Ratman, Shraver.
All the men, all the X-Men.
Yeah.
Wolverine,
Dora the Explorer. Fucking.
all of them. Yep.
Wolfman, Ratman, Nightcrawler.
No one knows about that one. That's a deep cut. You don't know that he analyzed Nightcrawler. Why Nightcrawler? Why not Daycrawler?
Oh shit! Yeah, that's true.
So I don't know. You were just talking about this. Tell me about.
Yeah, I was talking. Yeah, and like he points out, like remember what Freud does with it, because Dora is hysteric, and at this point in time, Freud is not sufficiently aware. He rewrote it and repeated it everywhere. Like this whole thing about this obsession with homosexuality in Dora, like this lesbianism. But it's like, was it because she actually felt that way, or what? Like it was the key to attain the father's recognition and desire, and mastering that, not mastering the desire, but mastering herself by knowing that she knows what her father wants, and being like never getting that recognition from her father. I think that's what he's trying to get at.
And that father occupies the virtual image there. And also
Frauke, I think Frauke is more on the imaginary plane.
The point from which she is seen as well.
Yes. And she's always talking about like Frauke and these sexual connotations, and like how white her skin is and how beautiful she looks, this, that, and the third, and like fantasizing about her. But it's like, what I think the structures of these sexual fantasies and eroticisms are trying to build up to is this scaffolding of something that you could say as, this is what my father desires.
Interesting.
Yeah. And
desire is the desire of the other, and that's why.
Bars.
Yeah, exactly. Bars for days. More bars than a jail cell right here.
Klondikes, because what would you do for them?
Damn. Yeah, because whenever you hear this phrase like desire is the desire of the other, you always have to rethink it constantly because you can't really pin it down. But sometimes it's like we act a certain way for someone's attention. We never get what we want, or when we get what we want, we're ashamed of the way we acted to get it. We don't like what we got.
You're onto something because we can't see you anymore. Yeah, there you go.
See, every time I'm like spitting, image disappears. You see that?
Yeah.
Even Zoom knows. But there's always a disjunction, some kind of discordance
Yeah.
that is the place of desire. But that's not even the point I want to emphasize. Is that I feel like what a good analysis should do is draw your attention to, like, for whom are you acting this way? And then what is this act? And
Yeah.
you have a certain performance. Well, think of an actor, right? How does an actor know how to convey emotion in a way that other people are going to respond to, pick up on, be effectively understated or over the top when
Yeah.
needed? It's like, how do you actually determine that dialectic? No one can really define it for you,
It's
but
funny.
it's there, and it needs to be pinned down at least momentarily in these moments.
Definitely. And when you brought up actors, it actually aligns with what Zizek talks about, like, was it improv actors, like where the director has like the little earphone and he's speaking to the actors like through the earpiece
Right.
and bringing out the best of themselves in it. So they're not really improvising from their heart, but actually guided by the other, this voice in their ears that's telling them, giving them some suggestions.
Right. And the other isn't an actual other. It's not a little other.
Yeah.
Your actual father is little other, but the place that the father occupies, the symbolic space, corresponds to the big other.
Yeah.
Doing these things for the big other. And this is why such confusion takes place. But when it comes to trying to satisfy a parent, the confusion is a consequence of the fact that there's this dissymmetry between the symbolic space that the other occupies and then the actual decrepit, deteriorating contingent figure of the real person that you're doing this for. And obviously, like, people complain about the fact that they don't get the validation they want from their parents. They never felt love in the household. But
Yeah.
even when you do get it, the problem is, and you were talking about this before earlier today, where it's kind of like, well, sometimes like an overabundance of attention or care, what we call love, can also be debilitating. And that it's like, what happens is that there's always a problematic disjunction between the symbolic space of a parent and their actual figure, and that it doesn't matter if they validate you necessarily. There's
Yeah.
always going to be a struggle when it comes to performing.
Yeah. What
For them.
was it when I was like talking about like the young and the mother complexes? And I mentioned
Exactly.
what was it from it was the one kid Stan, I think is with the overly dependent mother that's always like worried about him and thinking that he's getting hurt every time he goes out, and then when he grows up he's like a neurotic.
I haven't seen it.
You never seen both of them, like either the OG ones or the, oh, those are good.
No, I gotta watch it.
Yeah, or just read it, this is also good too.
But
But
I
yeah,
think
like that's what I think. Like when I think of like the Jungian devouring mother, I think of her. Um, but yeah, in that sense, like this like over excess of recognition and affection could lead to detrimental effects as well.
but it's also like, tell me if I'm wrong about this. Is this also an example of Freud where he's like proffering for his patient an interpretation? Here, you love her K, and
Yeah,
has the opposite effect. It again, it's like it's never about the accuracy of the interpretation. It's about the presentation of the
The
interpretation.
present, yeah, definitely. I think that's what he's trying to get at too, more than like the fact of like Freud realizing the dangers of countertransference, but
Right.
like coming up with like an interpretation that utilizes a purpose. Not that it's right or it's wrong, but does it utilize like a function and has an effect?
Right. It, what
So
would have happened?
yeah. So in a sense, it's like kind of like it's not like they're like pragmatist bros, but like in a sense, it serves as a tool. Maybe it brings about a resistance, but it's like then we work from there.
He said that's interesting. He said it's like a tool because it's like is it here where he talks about this like yeah. I really like the way he put this. You can wreck the analysis like Freud did there, as he admitted, or you're engaged in something different, and orthopedics of the ego. So like trying to change the skeletal structure
Yeah.
of the ego in a sense. And we've been talking about this from the very start. You're addressing the ego, you're trying to bring about a healthy ego. Um, and there's that temptation to interpret something in a given moment in a way that's going to be somehow like it's seen as like salutary from the point of view of the analyst, but it isn't. It can be actually like devastating. You could actually psychically destroy someone in a sense.
I was thinking too, because like it's like the orthopedics of the ego, like you're trying to restructure something, but sometimes like with certain like interpretations based upon what the analyst is giving, it's like sometimes you have to pull teeth.
Yeah.
With certain interpretations to be like, no, that's not right. Well, then what is it then? Tell me.
Well, so, I mean, like there's a value in deliberately presenting a distorted sort of interpretation just to elicit something from the patient.
Yeah. And it's not like because like the analyst is like maybe thinks that's the case, like although they could, but maybe they realize that they're really onto the analyst and like this motherfucker's lying. So I'm gonna kind of like call them out on their bullshit with this interpretation.
So at the risk of like oversimplifying it, is what he's saying here that Dora could have recognized her love of Frau K on her own if he had conducted things?
I think so, yeah, but it's the problem of not realizing that it's overall at the expense of like not realizing. It's pretty much like she doesn't want to like realize it's for the father's love. It may be a verneinung, it may be some type of rejection or refusal to realize the father's love that she's actually yearning for. And maybe I mean, I haven't read the case. Maybe there are some like homosexual tendencies between her and Frauke. I mean, I don't know if the connection between her and Frauke, like what their relationship was like, or if she was just this distant figure to her that she just idealized. Like, I don't know if she actually engaged with her on a day-to-day basis, or she just knew of her because her father spent more time with her compared with Dora. Probably would help later on if we did read this.
We should read it.
Yeah. Because it does get brought up a lot more, like in other seminars. This is what page now? We're on
185, almost.
85, yeah, we're out towards the end.
Yeah.
Speech must be embodied.
Right. That's what he says here. Freud had intervened by allowing the subject to name her desire because he didn't have to name it for her himself. The state of their life type would have been produced in the Oh,
virtual
the virtual
Yeah,
image.
exactly. And
So instead of it stemming from him,
yeah,
because he says that if he the analyst occupies the place of ideal eke in a sense, so then becomes tied up with the lib type,
yeah, the
almost like
and
becomes
the
the
thing
source
is,
of it then.
yeah, and it's like it makes me think it's like, well, what was Dr. Hook saying about how the analyst should occupy the place of the big other, not the little other, because then it's like you never realize what is in the symbolic register, the quilting point, because the analyst will always stay at the level of the imaginary. So I wonder if, in a sense, Freud was trying to get at that aspect.
Once you become the source of name, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
If you become the source of signifiers and names, then
Yeah.
suddenly you've occupied that place. That's really interesting. That's
Yeah.
why you have to be mum most of the time and be very careful.
Yeah. And that existential therapist was like, "Oh, I don't do transference because I'm not somebody's mother."
Wait, who said that?
Some random existential therapist that I follow on Instagram. It's like existential therapy, but I was like, how does transference relate into that? And she's like, "Oh, I don't do transference because I'm not somebody's mother."
You don't do transfer? How do you not do
Yeah,
transfer?
I never I didn't understand that. Like, I was like, what does
Not
that
like
even
a choice, really.
mean? Yeah.
You don't get to choose to transfer or not. It just
Yeah.
happens.
So long as you're conscious and you're speaking, you're gonna have transference.
Yeah. It's happening right now.
I just don't do breathing.
I don't do transference. Like, oh, cool. You're a badass, I guess. Like, congratulations. But yeah, so this is what we're saying. The ideal ego, um, taking his seat at the level of the ideal ego.
Yeah.
Recognition of desire can only be possible if that seat is taken, in a sense.
Of the analyst taking that seat.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And then now we get into the superego, which is just a little cliffhanger here, because that I feel like that's the missing element here is the superego.
Yeah.
The superego is going to tell us what we should be symbolically and shame us for never reaching that height,
Yeah.
essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Because then the next chapter we talk about what is at the core of repression. And I think that's why he's like now talking more about the superego. Not that it is at the core of repression, but like maybe it has something to play into repression and trauma. But yeah, that's definitely it's definitely a hefty topic. And I mean, this one was a short one, but it's definitely a lot to deal with, especially with towards understanding how with Dora, it's not so much about um this thing of genital love, but in a sense, this relationship of Freud and Dora was like obviously a transference and a counter transference, but it's like there was certain speech that was involved with the mooring or the mooring of speech that was involved to try to elucidate this desire for the father. but in a sense displacing it onto Dora without, or not Dora, onto Frau K without coming to terms with like it's your father's desire.
Well, isn't it also that speech was more directly to Freud?
That too, yeah.
That was the problem.
In the countertransference, I believe,
Because
well.
he occupied the place also of this virtual subject.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, what do you think? Should we end it there?
I just thought it was interesting as he mentions her contemplating the image of the Madonna.
Oh.
But I don't know. I don't know if I understand that, but
yeah, it's definitely pretty.
whew, all right, yeah. Let's end it there. Next chapter, we'll talk about the handling of the transference.
Damn.
I apologize for the length, but what can I say? There's
No,
no summarizing this stuff.
that's good.